The UN's humanitarian chief says they're still dealing with the emergency phase of the exploded Karkhovka Hydroelectric Dam in Ukraine. This is 11 days since the structures collapsed. The UN believes it represents the most significant incident damage to infrastructure, as well as they say that this has also caused flooding and massive displacement, while an unprecedented 700,000 people are now facing dire shortages of drinking water. In a sit-down with SABC News, Martin Griffiths also touched on the developing humanitarian situation in Sudan as the conflict there enters its third month, pointing to fighting in the Darfur region and warning that it was spiraling into a humanitarian calamity. Here's now the full discussion.
Martin Griffiths, welcome to SABC News.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You told the Security Council earlier this month that the destruction of the Karkhovka Hydroelectric Power Plant Dam was possibly the most significant incident of damage to civilian infrastructure since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year. What are your key takeaways 10 days into this evolving crisis?
Firstly, that we're still, which shows the depth of the problem, we're still dealing with the emergency phase. You know, what happens in a situation like that, in a different way with earthquakes or floods elsewhere, is that you have an immediate need to rescue people and to provide for their immediate survival needs, food and water and so forth. And we're still involved in that. We've just been reaching 200,000 people in that area. However, what we still don't know is the real extent of the damage to Ukraine, its economy, and because the area now being flooded is the breadbasket of Ukraine, right. And that's the breadbasket of the world.
So let's talk a little bit about the early evaluation of the extent of this disaster, right? Experts describe the aftermath of this dam's destruction as a fast-moving disaster that is quickly evolving into a long-term environmental catastrophe affecting drinking water, food supplies, ecosystems that reach the Black Sea, flooded lands, flooded farms, fish gasping on mud flats, fauna submerged. Speak to the long-term consequences here, right?
That's it. I mean, all of those things are true. I'd add one more, which is floating mines. This is also the most mined area in the world.
It's a war zone.
And so it's a war zone, and the floods are moving the mines to places where they had not been noticed before. But we don't have a good assessment yet of the environmental damage. There was a statement, I think, out of Moscow today, saying that we need to see the floodwaters recede before we can assess the damage to arable lands and crops and so forth. But we can deduce it.
Right.
We can deduce it. 700,000 people in that area used to depend on the Karkhovka reservoir for fresh water, right. Drinking water, no longer available. And you know, without drinking water, safe drinking water, we get diseases particularly where children are particularly prone, cholera and so on. Right. So we're not yet into these consequential phases, but we can deduce food prices are going to go up around the world, absolutely for sure. The economy of many people in Ukraine is going to suffer. Yeah. And as you said at the beginning, it's the biggest attack on civilian infrastructure since the war started, and that is indeed contrary to international humanitarian law.
I want to talk about humanitarian access. Denise Brown, the humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine this week, said the UN has engaged both the governments of Ukraine and the Russian Federation to ensure access to all civilians impacted by the dam's destruction. But you have yet to receive security guarantees from Russia in order to cross the front line. Why is this proving so difficult given the obvious needs for civilians on both sides of the front line?
Well, you'd have to ask the Russians the answer to that question.
What have they told you?
Well, we have been in continuous contact. Indeed, I was here the day after the flood with the permanent mission of the Russian Federation here, putting in our first request. There's a process that has been worked out in the context of the Ukraine war, whereby we notify Ukraine and the Russian Federation when we want to do a convoy movement into an unsafe area or to cross the line, as is the case here. And we notify them. We don't ask for their permission, right, because there's a humanitarian principle at stake, but we notify them to ensure that it's safe and secure. So It's taking time to get that response from the Russian Federation, and we're still very busily involved in it, and we're hoping, I don't know, in the next few days, to be able to make those cross-line movements work.
What we have heard from the Russian PR here, Ambassador Nebenzer, is that they would prefer the UN to access these civilians from the side that they control. Why is that not an option for the UN?
Well, there is, first of all, because our operation is based in Ukraine, and Denise Brown and her team are based in Ukraine, and the supplies will come from that operation, a big, mega-funded, huge operation that's been going since the beginning of the war. That's where we're coming from. So we don't make a decision about where to come from on political grounds, but we do very clearly on the grounds of efficiency and available supplies. And so we're ready to cross that river and to deliver aid.
What can you say, USG, about cooling water for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant's reactors, which are supplied by this dam? The IAEA has in recent days expressed concern about the falling water levels that are so key to the operability of water pumps that cool the reactors. Do you fear a worst-case scenario here?
Well, as if we didn't need more consequences for this single operation, the blasting of the dam. Zaporizhzhia is right there in the frame, and as you said, we've heard from Mr. Grossi of IAEA that he's very worried because of the cooling water needs, which are now becoming more difficult to fill. I know they're very busy with trying to make sure to manage it, and I think we're not in the danger zone yet, but we could be.
Final question on Ukraine. A group of African heads of state are due in Kyiv and Moscow into the weekend as part of a peace initiative that is led by South Africa's president, with the fate of the grain deal expected to be part of their discussions, given signals, of course, from Russia that it might exit the deal next month. What are some of the humanitarian outcomes you seek from this peace initiative?
The first humanitarian outcome would be peace, would be wonderful. And so I think...
Let's start there.
Let's start there. The presidents, I think there are 6 of them, going to Kyiv and also to Russia, should be congratulated for taking this initiative and taking the time to do it. And it's a voice from the global south saying, we are suffering also from the consequences of this war. And we see it, and they see it very specifically in the context of food security. Hence the Black Sea grain initiative is important to have it continue. But just to be reminded, for all of us to be reminded, that the people of the world want to see an honourable and just peace as soon as possible. That's the message I think they'll be taking. We hope, and I believe they will, also be saying, let's not let the Black Sea initiative drop. We need it to continue. It's sent almost 32 million tonnes across the Black Sea up till now. We need to step it up and keep it alive.
Is enough of that grain getting to Africa?
43% of the 31.5 million tonnes have gone to the least developed countries, of which Africa is a part. But as we've often explained, this is an operation which relies on the private sector.
It's commercial.
It's commercial,
yeah.
But with huge humanitarian benefits, which is why I was involved with the Secretary General in its mediation. And those benefits are as important today as they ever were. And that, I think, is the voice of Africa.
A couple of questions on Sudan, if I may. Sudan, of course, continues to be a country of major concern from a humanitarian standpoint, with no end in sight to the fighting between these two military factions. The Secretary General this week saying he's appalled by reports of large-scale violence and casualties across the Darfur region as this conflict expands further outside of the capital, Khartoum. What is your reading of where we go from here?
Well, we can start by getting aid to those places which have not received it, and Darfur is one of those. So we have just shy of 9 million people in Darfur needing humanitarian aid and not getting it. So those two militaries, with whom we're in daily contact, of course, need to help us make those deliveries happen safely. We've tried from Chad across the border into Darfur, and we're now trying, and it didn't work because of safety problems, security problems, and we're now doing it coming in from the east, Port Sudan. But it is of vital importance. And Darfur is not the only place, as you say, there's Khartoum. There's also a planting season coming up in Sudan. And if we don't get seeds to the farmers pre-positioned, then we're going to have a failure of the harvest. And that will compound the problems. But the issue at the moment for us is access, safe access. Stop the looting of humanitarian warehouses. Let our people through.
I was going to touch on the looting, right? And it goes to the heart of the question, how long can humanitarians work under these conditions when you have health facilities that are being attacked, you have humanitarian infrastructure that is being attacked, including the looting of warehouses, as you mentioned. Humanitarian law appears to be on the back burner for now, not so? And that makes it an untenable situation for people like yourself.
And in many parts of the world. What was important for us, and for me personally at the outset, was that the two militaries signed what we call a declaration of commitments and what has been termed the Jeddah Declaration.
How's that holding up?
In pieces or in parts, because of the fact that there is often not command and control, and the war has its own dynamic and its own existential quality. So that we have, on occasion, been able to move, I think, up to 300 truck movements so far, thanks to the Jeddah negotiations. We have been able to access parts of Khartoum, and that's good news. But Darfur is still a heart of darkness for us, and it's also riven by terrible fighting. And the killing yesterday of the governor of West Darfur is only going to make it more dangerous.
Is there a role for the Security Council in terms of demanding that people like yourself and humanitarian actors get the access they require? I mean, there's the Jeddah talks, there's the African Union, there's IGAD, there's the United Nations. Nobody really knows who's leading this process now. Is that confusing for you?
It's not confusing for us because we have been closely involved both in the Jeddah process, which is focused on humanitarian, and will now the IGAD process, which is put humanitarian as its first priority. But your question about the council, I think what we would all like to see is a lot more speed and urgency put into mediating a solution to this conflict, not only with the two militaries, but with the civilian population of Sudan present and actively involved to return Sudan to where it was before 2 months ago. The message that I think the Security Council should be sending, and I'm sure it would be happy to do so, is to say to the region, to say to the world, let this stop now. Yes, we need to stop the fighting for humanitarian reasons, but that never lasts without a political horizon. And that is certainly my experience. So we need to have a political future for Sudan, and we need to have it urgently.